Starting off with major news, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett now returning from his meeting with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the first official trip by an Israeli Prime Minister to Egypt in a decade. And the pair describing the sit-down as overwhelmingly positive.
סיימתי עכשיו ביקור ראשון אצל נשיא מצרים. הפגישה הייתה חשובה מאוד וטובה מאוד. במהלך הפגישה בראש ובראשונה יצרנו תשתית וקשר עמוק להמשך הדרך. אנחנו דנו בשורה של סוגיות בתחום המדיני, בתחום הביטחוני, בתחום הכלכלי, ובדרכים להעמיק את הקשר ולחזק את האינטרסים של המדינות שלנו.
The expanding partnerships then also including the full reopening of the Taba border crossing between Israel and the Sinai to tourists and the introduction of several weekly EgyptAir flights between Cairo and Tel Aviv starting October. But joining me now with more is expert on Arab world geopolitics with NYU and the Moshe Dayan Center, Dr. Joshua Krasna. Dr. Krasna, thanks so much for being with us. Now, first off, the last official visit by an Israeli prime minister to Egypt was when Prime Minister Netanyahu met with former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in January 2011, just before the uprising that toppled him. Why did it take so long for another meeting?
So first of all, there have been meetings between Israeli prime ministers and Egyptian presidents, between Sisi and Netanyahu since then, in the United Nations General Assembly in 2017, 2018, and reportedly there may have been unofficial visits, or at least unannounced visits or unannounced meetings that the two have had since then. One of the things that we have to remember is that for quite a while, and certainly between 2011 and 2013, of course, there was tremendous amount of disarray and a short-lived Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt. Since 2013, when Sisi came in, Egypt has been very busy. The Egyptian president, the Egyptian regime, is very busy sort of putting their domestic house and international house in order. And I think that they didn't want to have the noise of a visit. The relationship has been quite good. In fact, it's been almost good in an almost unparalleled way since 2013. But I think the profile of the relations, it was important for the Egyptians to keep it fairly low. But in recent weeks and months, the Egyptians have been making a more concerted push in the region to increase their diplomatic profile. They're working a lot with Iraq. They're working a lot with Jordan. And Egypt is taking a much more active role in the past year or two in regional issues. And I think that they see the new Israeli government in this context as being a good opportunity to bring the optics of the relationship in line with the actual content of the relationship, which, as I said, have been extremely good in recent years.
Okay, well, speaking of renewing or increasing ties, possibly even on the backs of Egypt, Bennett is saying that Israel is opening to other countries in the region with the Egypt-Israel peace as the bedrock for expanding regional partnerships. How often does Egypt actually help broker ties between Israel and other Arab states, or how often have they been involved in such brokerages? And what's Egypt's overall influence over other Arab states' decisions?
So that's two different questions, right? I don't think Egypt has been very involved. Egypt has been, of course, all along very involved in our process with the Palestinians. I'm not sure. There may well be an Egyptian aspect in the relationship, in the let's say the willingness of the military part of the new Sudanese regime to pursue a relationship with Israel. On the other hand, other than that, we haven't really seen any major activity by Egypt to promote other countries normalizing with Israel. The second part of your question, Egypt has a significant amount of influence among Arab countries, especially among the smaller Arab countries, especially among the countries nearby to it. But I don't think that I don't visualize Egypt being let's say a matchmaker in any kind of formal way in the foreseeable future. It's just not something that I think that they're interested in doing.
Okay, now I want to ask actually about how Egypt-Israel peace might actually be improved, because if we compare, the opening of the Taba crossing and direct flights to Cairo to just 1 year of peace with the UAE, the difference is tremendous. Why do you think that it has taken so long just to get to a remotely close level of relations with Egypt as opposed to other nations?
So on the first hand, I'll correct, right? We don't have a remotely close relationship with Egypt. We have a very close relationship with Egypt, but it's below the surface. Our security relationship with Egypt, our security alliance with Egypt is really a very significant part of both countries' national security.
But that's at a government level as well. But that's also at a
right,
very high level.
That's at a government level. Yes, so I would say that there are three things, and I'll do it quick. The first is Egypt is the largest, is the most populous Arab state, and sees itself, its image is that it is also the most significant state in the Arab world. Remember also that Egypt fought 4 wars against Israel. In terms of UAE and Bahrain, were perhaps philosophically opposed to Israel, but they didn't have this sort of deep down enmity that develops when two countries have fought wars for a long time. So that's one thing. So Egypt is a very large country with which is always very the leadership is always very careful, certainly since 2011, to listen to what's going on at the grassroots level. At the grassroots level, there isn't a whole lot of enthusiasm for the peace treaty with Israel. In fact, in general, right, in the Arab world, the leaderships are out ahead of the peoples. So the UAE is a very modernized country. The UAE is a very westernized country. The UAE is a country that is physically far from Israel and has not had a particularly fraught history with Israel. On the other hand, Egypt is a country that's fought wars with Israel. It's a big country with a lot of different security challenges and a lot of different problematical trends within the country, and which is our next door neighbor, right? So your relations with your close neighbors are always going to be a little bit more complicated than your relationship with your more distant neighbors.
All right, Dr. Joshua Krasno, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, now a tragedy over Greek airspace, sending huge ripples back towards Jerusalem. 2 Israelis reported dead after their personal aircraft crashed outside the islands of Samos Monday evening. This as their Cessna 182 encountered a problem on the approach to the island's airport after taking off from Haifa in Israel. And the victims, now identified as married couple Chaim and Esti Garon. There were no other passengers on board. As for the how, according to initial reports, the personal craft suffered from a yet unknown technical issue with the engine, and it disappeared from radars around 8 p.m. Israel time. Coast Guard officials saying that they spotted the debris in the sea about a mile south of the airport. 3 ships and a helicopter rushing to the scene. But here's where things get particularly hairy. Chaim Garon was the state's witness for the prosecution against former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is facing corruption charges in 3 different cases, and while not a key witness, as the former deputy director of the communications ministry, Garon is set to testify in case 4000 or the Bezek affair. Additionally, apart from the fact that relatives say Garon was a frequent and responsible pilot, the 4-passenger Cessna 182 is considered a very safe and reliable craft, a favorite for training and civilian use. So was there any foul play? Well, there's no evidence for such an accusation just yet. Only conspiracy theories and an investigation which is still in its infancy. In other news, we fly now to the United States. The FBI recently releasing its latest statistics on hate crimes across the country. And on the surface, the outlook is good. While anti-Semitic hate crimes still make up for the vast majority of religiously motivated incidents, the total number of hate crimes is slightly down from previous years. The problem, though, is that this report may not reflect the whole picture. The results, in part, may be due to the pandemic and a stark reduction in public Jewish street life. Additionally, according to the ADL, the FBI's numbers are severely underreported, and they only looked as far as 2020, so none of the attacks that spiked in response to the conflict with Hamas in May are included either. So, what are we to believe? Democratic New York State Assemblyman Charles Levine is joining us with more. Thank you so much for joining us, Assemblyman. Now, what can you tell us about the recent spike in anti-Semitism and the efforts being made to curb this phenomenon, particularly as we've seen in New York?
Thank you for the invitation to be on ILTV. Unfortunately, over the course of the last years, those who hate and New York alone, and the United States alone, do not have an exclusive population of people who hate. But those who hate, and especially those who hate Jews and other minorities, have felt that they have had the right, they have been enabled to express this hatred. We can think back to the demonstrations at Charlottesville 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, when people were chanting, Jews will not replace us, by marching around with torches. We would never have thought to see this in the United States, but for many reasons, many of them political, those folks have thought that they have the ability now to be able to express their anger and their hatred and their prejudice. The best ways for us to approach those particular issues is simply to stand together as people of good faith. And real Americans are people of good faith. I question whether some of those folks who delight in expressing hatred and anger and expressing violence are real Americans. But this is not unique. We see this on a worldwide basis, and the best thing we can do is stand together and stand up. We are not innocent bystanders. We are upstanders, and we will not tolerate that sort of brutal hatred.
All right, so I'd like to press a little bit on this. You know, anti-Israel and so-called anti-Zionism has often been used as a smokescreen for anti-Semitic acts, and there have been a vocal number of voices, many from within the Democratic Party, that have been severely criticizing Israel and calling for diminishing ties. As a Jewish New York assemblyman, have you felt any pressure in this regard?
I've felt absolutely no pressure from those elements. We have zany elements on both sides of the political spectrum. There is nothing new in this phenomenon. I view both of those sides of the spectrum, both of those edges of the spectrum, the same way. Yes, we'll listen to them. We have elements on the right, members of the Republican Party, who openly court Nazis and fascists and justify the acts of those who invaded our capital on January the 6th. Those people were not people who were friends to the Jewish people. And while at the same time, on the outer fringes of the left, there are those who are anti-Israel and at the same time anti-Semitic. We have to be cautious of all these folks. And we also have to be extremely cautious of political people who engage in demagoguery, right, and those who enable others to hate and express their hatred.
All right, so now generally speaking, the state of New York and Israel have actually always held a fairly close relationship, particularly with New York. For example, just before the coronavirus erupted, the two states formed a special partnership to promote innovation, smart cities, and economic ties. What is the status of the partnership today, and have advancements been made in some of these areas recently?
Tremendous advances have been made. The state of New York and Israel are very strong trade partners. There's been well over $100 billion in trade between New York and Israel since the mid-1990s. And the last figures we have for this trade are 2020, and it was nearly $3 billion worth of trade. Good trade partners are good allies, and good allies are good trade partners. In addition to that, there are other foundational partnership elements that are at play here. The partnership between New York's Cornell University and the Technion on Roosevelt Island is at the forefront of scientific development and scientific research. This means billions of dollars of additional trade, and it also means that Israel and New York and Israel and the United States will continue to be at the cutting edge of scientific development. That is good for Israel, that is good for New York, it's good for the United States, and it's good for the entire.
Well, so if I can interrupt real quick, Governor Cuomo has resigned. He's been replaced by Kathy Hochul. what can we expect from the New York-Israel relationships going forward under her new tenure?
So let me express a bias here. And it's not a bias against Governor Cuomo, but it is a bias, a personal bias in favor, not against, in favor of Kathy Hochul, who I have known for many years and worked with very closely for many years. Governor Hochul is an extraordinary person. She is smart. She is tough. She is fully familiar with New York's government, and she is fully familiar with the government of the United States, having served an extraordinary and a term full of integrity in the United States House of Representatives. I look forward to continued great relations between New York State and the state of Israel under Governor under Governor Hochul's leadership. I'm used to saying Governor Cuomo for so many years that it is now Governor Hochul, and I'll have to get used to that, and I will get used to that. Let me add one additional factor that I think is truly important. Governor Hochul comes from modest circumstances growing up. She has a great feel for the middle class in the United States. And one last unashamed plug for Governor Hochul. Governor Hochul also has a tremendous amount of integrity and charisma. I look forward to a continued wonderful relationship between our state of New York and the state and nation of Israel.
All right. Assemblyman Levine, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much again for joining us and speaking with us today.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's been a pleasure. Everybody stay safe.
You too. Moving on, with the rise of vaccinations, many are starting to forget about long COVID, or the long-term side effects of having contracted the coronavirus. But a new Israeli health ministry study is now putting it back into the spotlight, as data shows that over 10% of recovered children are suffering from the disease. Hannah Rifkin with the report.
Thousands of Israeli children now getting the worst that coronavirus has to offer. Beyond just catching the disease, a new study revealing that some 11% of infected children aged 3 through 18 experiencing symptoms long after their recuperation. The study, including a telephone questionnaire of nearly 14,000 parents with kids aged 3 through 18 and conducted by the Israel Health Ministry, was published on Monday. In any case, continuing illness, exhaustion or fatigue, breathlessness, these are just some of the myriad of symptoms of long COVID, an autoimmune-like response to the coronavirus that many patients suffer from, sometimes even several months after recovering from the disease. In fact, among the children with long COVID symptoms, 4.6% of 12 through 18-year-olds and 1.8% of kids under 12 suffered for more than 6 months. This resulting in further damage to the body, including to the brain, blood vessels, and liver. Reported issues including deterioration of neurological, cognitive, and mental health abilities, sleep disturbances, concentration problems, and more, as compared to before the kids got infected. As for which demographics are more at risk, it turns out that children of all ages who have a symptomatic infection are more likely to experience long COVID symptoms too, though at least 3.5% of asymptomatic children are also getting long COVID. Additionally, an age factor seems to have been discovered, where kids aged 12 and older were more susceptible to developing long COVID symptoms. By extension, then, it's no surprise that some 10% of infected adults aged 18 through 49 also develop long COVID, as well as some 20% of those over the age of 70. All this aside, though, the health ministry warning to take the data with a grain of salt, as the survey is based on self-reporting and not necessarily on doctors' diagnoses. Additionally, without a control group, some of the recorded effects may have nothing to do with the virus at all. Rather, some of the lower performance issues could be connected to the lockdowns, school closures, and recent conflicts with Hamas.
Now, it's been nearly a year since Israeli startup SpaceIL announced its second lunar mission, the Beresheet II, and it's slated to be launched into space towards the end of 2024. But until then, SpaceIL is issuing an open call for proposals, asking international bodies from all over the globe to submit their experiments for a chance to hitch a ride out of orbit. Aerospace correspondent for CTech by Kalkalist Yafit Ovadia joins us with more. Yafit, it is a pleasure to have you back with us. Thank you so much.
It's good to be back.
All right, so my first question, what are the new developments concerning the Beresheet?
Well, first of all, SpaceIL has managed to raise the requisite funding of $70 million, so now they can begin construction of the craft.
Wow.
And second of all, the shift and focus of the second Beresheet mission is different. It has shifted from that of the first. The first was mainly focused on Israel, and it didn't really contain any experiments on board, just some patriotic paraphernalia. But the second, on the other hand, is open to other countries, allowing them to send their experiments and ideas to space.
I guess it's probably for the best, seeing as how the first one had a rocky landing at
Yes,
best.
you could say that.
So, what about maybe some new developments concerning astronauts?
Concerning Eitan Stiva, well, he's been quite busy. He's been spending time in Florida and in Texas at the NASA training facilities and also at the SpaceX training facilities with the rest of his crew. He's been trying out the zero gravity machine, and he's also met with a lot of experts in Israel who are representatives from some of the companies whose experiments he's going to be taking with him to the space station. And probably the most exciting of all, a final date for his flight was just announced. It will be February 2nd, 2022.
Have an official date then. That is spectacular. All right.
Yes.
Back to the experiments. What kinds of experiments are we looking to send with Beresheet? What maybe are the experiments that are best suited for the moon?
Well, first of all, they can either fit and be on board the landers or on the orbiter. Recall, it's a three-part spacecraft. So those geared for the orbiter need to study stuff on the ground. So that would be lunar soil, astrobiology, lunar environmental conditions, even lunar sustainability, how humans can produce food and water from the moon. And those can last up to 72 hours, while the ones geared toward the lander have a slightly longer lifespan. They can last between 2 and 5 years, because the orbiter plans on being in operation for that time, and they'll study the moon from a distance, so in areas such as remote sensing or the lunar orbit.
How many people have applied? What kinds of experiments are maybe already under review, and when's the deadline?
Okay, well, the deadline is November 15th, and the winners will be announced in 1 month after that, so in December. It's open to pretty much any academic institution or university, research.
No individuals who just happen to be super awesome and smart and submit something worthy?
Unfortunately not, but it's also open to companies who have groundbreaking ideas. And of course, those organizations have to be, in some sense, have some type of diplomatic relationship with Israel.
All right. Well, I think we have a lot to look forward to, especially in November and December when we start to see what these experiments will be. And of course, very excited for Eitan Stiva.
Yes.
Yafit, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Now, some clouds passing through over the next few days, and meteorologists predicting scattered showers in Israel's north on Thursday over the Yom Kippur holiday. Now, we're gradually heading into Israeli autumn as temperature cooldowns continue. Lows tonight between 18 to 27 degrees Celsius, and tomorrow's highs ranging from 27 to 37 degrees Celsius. Now back to the studio with Aaron.
And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel.
אמא, מה עשית? מה עשית? מה אכפת לי מהניקיון? תראי את השמפו שאת חופפת איתו. עדן שולדרס של כלבים. מה? זה של גוצ'י. מה זה? אמא!
All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.21 shekels to the American dollar and 2.54 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. Gmar Chatima Tova. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.